Okay. Um, so, secession. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the individual battles. I will talk about some of the technological innovations, warfare. It's the beginning of modern warfare in the American Civil War. That's why we have it's such a bloody conflict. Um, the war in your textbook is really kind of what's the expression? It's conservative estimates of the death in the Civil War. But even with these conservative estimates, more Americans die in the Civil War than in all of the other wars the United States has ever fought in, combined. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, including the modern conflicts with Iraq and Afghanistan. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all of those other conflicts put together. The answer is really simple as to why. There's really a couple reasons, but the primary reasons is because it's Americans killing Americans. Americans killing Americans. Plus, we've got new technologies that are going to make warfare much more efficient, and the ability to kill other people much easier. More accurate firearms, massive artillery technologies, and even the ironclads, the ships that defensively cannot be sunk with a cannonball. Because of their iron hulls, the cannonballs just literally bounce off their hull. There's even the use of the first successful use in combat of a submarine. The Confederates build a submarine that they use to sink a Union ship, in Charleston Harbor. So, we'll take a look at what we're talking about as far as the war. Now, 633,000 is the number of people that your textbook says, but his Civil War historian named McPherson says that number should be closer to 750,000. He believes it should be closer to 750,000 because the carnage is enormous. Now, if you look at the top map or the top graph, the vast majority, more than half of the individuals who died in the war died of disease. They died of disease, over 337,000. Now, mortally wounded, killed in combat, only 206,000. And then died in prisons or other causes, over 90,000. Union loses 373,000 troops, while the Confederacy loses around 260,000 troops. So why disease? Why disease? Well, it does so happen that during the American Civil War there is an outbreak of influenza, and massive influenza outbreak that is going to take the lives of an enormous number of people. But also included in this number of disease is the people who die from infections, right? We have no penicillin. We have none of these antibiotics that we have today. And so what would happen is when you get hit with one of these musket balls or a new designed bullet called a mini ball, they're usually 68 to 50 caliber soft lead projectiles. So half an inch round to 2/3 of an inch in diameter. When these projectiles hit you, if you're lucky, they hit you in one of your extremities. If you're not lucky, you get hit in the shoulder, you get hit in the abdomen, or you get hit in the waist. Because what's normally going to happen, there is morphine. They have synthesized morphine out of opium by this point, but supplies are low. Supplies are very low. So what's going to happen is in these field hospitals where you have these massive charges and people shooting each other at such close proximity and doing so much damage. If you get hit in the arm, in the forearm, what they're going to do is they're going to go up to the next joint and cut it off right there. That's why in all the movies that you see in the aftermath of the Civil War, you see people with one arm or one leg or no legs or no arms. It's because there was no way to stop the blood poisoning. There was no way to stop the infection. And some of these people, if you tried to save the arm, when you get hit, what happens is this soft lead ball is going to flatten, and it's going to cut a swatch in your clothing, and it's going to bury all that cloth inside your wound. And so all the foreign material, all the dirty cloth and everything gets packed inside the wounds. And even if they can pull the bullet out, then they got to try to pull out all the cloth. But usually there's still foreign matter in there, and what's going to happen is it's going to get infected. And most of these people who are dying of disease are dying of blood poisoning, they're dying of infections, and they're dying of gangrene. They're basically, their body just starts rotting. And if the blood poisoning gets to their brain or their heart, they finally expire. So massive individuals. The largest percentage, more than half of the people who die from these kinds of wounds rather than the wounds that are immediate. And so the idea of amputating, this radical amputation is an attempt to actually save these people's lives, but they wind up with single leg, they wind up living the rest of their lives as amputees. Now, the war itself. Why the war? Most people say slavery caused the Civil War. Well, we've had this discussion about cause and effect with regard to slavery, or with regard to history. History doesn't have cause and effect. History has reasons, because history is dependent upon human actions. Human actions are dependent upon reasons. Humans aren't caused in these kinds of ways. So some people say slavery. Well, Lincoln's reason for starting the war was to stop secession. But Lincoln believed secession was illegal. And if secession was illegal, then the states have never left the Union. The states are still part of the Union. The problem is they've got a state government that's in rebellion. Lincoln's philosophy, if we can displace the state government, we can install a loyal government, and the state is still part of the Union. So for Lincoln, it's an attempt to stop secession, to stop these state governments from rebelling against the United States, because Lincoln believes that these states have not left the Union. It's important to get this distinction, especially when we come to this area of Reconstruction. The Southerners, especially the poor farmers, who don't own slaves, the poor farmers are fighting for a states' rights kind of idea. Our rights as Alabamians are being oppressed, and we want our civil rights, blah 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 blah. And so they are fighting for this notion of states' rights. The Southern plantation owners, they're fighting over slavery. They're fighting over slavery. For them, this is the key issue. This is the point. For these Southern planters, slavery is the issue. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the thing that triggered secession for them was the fact that Lincoln was an outspoken abolitionist. And once he's elected president, they're ready to withdraw. They're ready to pull out. So the fight over the Civil War has these multiple aspects. Now, the war itself, the Battle of Fort Sumter that we just talked about earlier, is when the war starts. Lincoln calls for troops to go down to South Carolina to stop this sort of insurrection, and that's what starts the second wave of people who secede from the Union. Lincoln's first choice to lead his army is an army officer from Northern Virginia. An army officer from Northern Virginia. Because what you have to understand is Northern Virginia is right outside Washington, D.C. His first selection was Robert E. Lee. Lincoln wanted Robert E. Lee to lead the Army of the Potomac, as it was called. Now, some things about Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is married to George Washington's granddaughter. Actually, it's Martha Washington's granddaughter. Martha Washington had been married before and had children, and then her husband died, and she winds up marrying George Washington. So one of Martha Washington's granddaughters is going to be married to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee has a plantation right outside of Washington, D.C. And so Lincoln sends him word that he wants him, he's going to promote him to general, and he's going to put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Robert E. Lee, as Virginia is debating on whether or not to leave the Union, Robert E. Lee goes to the Virginia legislature and he pleads with them not to secede from the Union. It's part of their congressional record. He pleads with them not to secede from the Union. His family, the Lee family, has been involved in American history before its founding. Two of his ancestors are signatories in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. His grandfather, Light Horse Harry, had actually been very instrumental in fighting in the War of 1812 as a cavalryman. And so when Robert E. Lee joins the Army, the U.S. Army, Robert E. Lee is a cavalry officer. When John Brown attacks Harper's Ferry, Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Army cavalry is sent to stop John Brown from beginning this insurrection. So, he's not able to stop Virginia from seceding. So when Lincoln sends him word, Robert E. Lee goes to the White House and he turns in his resignation from the Army. Lincoln asks him what he's going to do, and he said, I believe they are going to ask me to be to lead the Army of Northern Virginia. And then they shake hands and he leaves. Robert E. Lee is going to lead this Army of Northern Virginia against the Army of the Potomac, which will have a number of different leaders. Eventually, George McClellan will be the one who leads it the most, but he will fail to take control of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a keen tactician, and he was a good officer. Eventually, George McClellan, who actually becomes a rival to Abraham Lincoln. George McClellan does not like Lincoln. McClellan is a Northern Democrat. Actually, it's pretty sure that McClellan believed in a continuation, in some sense, of the institution of slavery. Hence, the reason he's still a Democrat and not a Republican at this point. Okay, Robert E. Lee will, of course, be once the radical Republicans take over Reconstruction, they will punish Robert E. Lee for his involvement in the Civil War. They will take his plantation and seize all of his property and take his plantation away from him. His plantation was vast, and it's been it's been in Northern Virginia since well before the Declaration of Independence had been signed. His family owned this plantation. And like all of those grand plantations in the southern area, Robert E. Lee's plantation has a name. Robert E. Lee's plantation is named Arlington. Some of you may know what Arlington is. Today, it's a city outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. But it's also the National Cemetery. Since the Civil War, soldiers who were killed, especially at the Battle of Gettysburg, were sent back to Washington, D.C., and the Quartermaster General started burying the Union troops who were killed at Gettysburg in Lee's front yard. He said Robert E. Lee should have to wake up every morning and see the pain he has cost the nation. After the war is over, they seize Robert E. Lee's property and they turn it into the National Cemetery. There was, I guess, all the way up until World War I, his sort of mansion was sitting on the up on the hill overlooking most of the cemetery until it was struck by lightning and it burnt down. Since then, in recent days, they've actually rebuilt a 1/3 scale model of Robert E. Lee's home there on the top of the hill where the foundation was, as sort of a memorial. So Robert E. Lee will resign his position in the U.S. Army, and he will go and join the Army of Northern Virginia. George McClellan will be the soldier, the general who is most responsible for the Army of the Potomac, which Lee will perpetually, over and over and over again, outsmart, outwit, outfight until Sherman comes along. Now, we're not going to talk about a lot of this. We will talk about one of these important things, this Battle of Fort Sumter. Most of what's going on, as you can see up here in the top map, I know it's hard to see at this point, is Confederate victories in Northern Virginia. This is thanks to, again, Robert E. Lee fighting individuals like Burnside and Winfield Scott, and then McClellan, off and on, until we get to Antietam. In Antietam, Lee's forces are going to try to go into Maryland, and they'll be cut off there. But up until this point, Robert E. Lee is fairly victorious. However, in the West, the Confederacy is being beaten down fairly significantly. Tennessee is one of the first Confederate states that is almost completely pacified early on in the war. I guess it's sometime around 1862 that Tennessee will actually be completely pacified. Out here is where Sherman and Farragut and Bragg and all of these other individuals are making their way. They're coming down into this. The idea is they want to take possession of the Mississippi River because the Confederacy is receiving help from the British and from the French. From the British and from the French, because the British and the French want the cotton. The British and the French want the cotton. And the Confederacy uses cotton as a diplomatic tool to gain weapons and materials and other things. And so what the Union needs to do is take Louisiana and the Mississippi River. And if they can take possession of the Mississippi River, then not only does it stop this massive trade route for the Confederacy, but it cuts off the eastern part of the Confederacy with Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas is cut off from the main body of the forces at this point. So it's a fairly decent strategy that the Union has in the West, and there's going to be massive victories in the West, while Robert E. Lee is going to be trouncing George McClellan and the other generals early on during this period. Now, this is at this point in March 1862, we do have the first clash of what are called the ironclads. These ironclads are ships built out of metal. They are ships built out of metal. The Virginians have a ship called the Merrimac. The Confederacy has a ship called the Merrimac. The Union has a ship called the Monitor. The Monitor kind of looks like a submarine. Most of its hull is actually underwater with its deck just out of the water with a massive cannon turret on the top. And from this cannon turret, they're able to fire their cannonballs. The Confederacy has the ironclad, the Merrimac, which looks like a long tent with portholes, with cannons coming out. These two ships meet, okay? These two ships meet right off the coast of North Carolina, close to the Virginia border, and these two ships sail back and forth, shooting their cannonballs at each other, shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting until both of them run out of cannonballs. The problem is the cannonballs keep bouncing off their hulls because our defensive technology had so outstripped our offensive technology that there was just, we couldn't sink them. Eventually, when they run out of ammunition, the two ships sail apart and they're gone. There's also another ironclad that's built as an ocean-going vessel. It's a steamship that has masts so that it can also use sails, called the Alabama. The Alabama doesn't really fight. It's a Confederate ship, doesn't fight here, right? But it fights on the trade routes in the Mediterranean and along the African coast and even into the Indian Ocean. It attacks American shipping, the supplies that are being brought from other countries to the Union Army. It will attack those ships and seize the cargoes in order to keep the Americans, the Northerners, from getting their supplies. The Alabama will wreak havoc. Now, these ironclads and the Alabama are being built for the Confederacy by the British. The British want free and open access to the South's cotton. And the South negotiates with the British that they will let them carry away as much cotton if they help them break the blockade, because the Union Army is going to try to blockade the entire coast. Of course, their navy isn't that large, and so these blockade running ships are going to be able to sneak in and out. This is a big deal, considering the fact that if what the South wants the British to do is to give them 10,000 troops plus half of their navy. And if the British will agree to do that, then the South believes it can maintain its identity as an independent country, independent of the United States. But for the English, the idea is far more complicated because, number one, they do have an alliance with the United States of America. However, everything they want from the United States of America is in this part of the country, in the Confederacy. So England has to figure out, and in the first analysis, the idea is that they're going to support the Confederacy because the Confederacy is the group that has the cotton. And so the English are going to start making all these weapons and everything, and it'll not be until Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation that it forces England to stop supporting the Confederacy. Once the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, Abraham Lincoln is going to make it impossible for the British to turn a blind eye to the fact that their continuation of support of the Confederacy is a continuation of supporting the institution of slavery. England abolished slavery way back in 1807. And so in 1807, the English had abolished the institution, and for the English businesses to be supporting the Confederacy at this point, the Parliament finally has to step in and put a stop to it. It's after this, it's after 1863, a gamble that Abraham Lincoln took it was well timed. It really puts the Confederacy in the lurch, and things start going downhill for them quickly after the British are eliminated as an ally. Let's see here. Let me jump forward. The latter years, 1863 to 1865, at the Battle of Vicksburg, there in 1863, when Vicksburg is laid siege to, eventually the Union is going to take possession of all this land. Arkansas will be under complete control of the Union Army. Most of Louisiana will be under Union control. A lot of Alabama, parts of Georgia. It will be here that Sherman in 1864 has his march to the sea, where he cuts this swatch through Georgia as he marches down to Savannah. The Western Army is routed, okay? And by that time, by 1864, there is only one Confederate army left in the field, and it's being led by a general named Johnston. Up here in the north, after Gettysburg, when Sherman arrives, Sherman is going to start, and now you'll start seeing all of these. Even though you will still have Confederate victories, you're going to see more Union victories. And eventually at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, you're going to see Robert E. Lee have to surrender to General Grant. Now, two big heroes in the war, General Grant and then Sherman. Sherman gets a really bad name um, because of this sort of cutting path that he goes through, because he's not fighting armies, he's going through attacking plantations and burning crops and making sure that the people in Georgia don't have the ability to feed and supply the Confederate Army. Both Sherman and Grant have an understanding of this concept of total war, okay, this concept of total war, and they are going to utilize it. Now, when we come back, we are going to discuss the most important month in all of American history, which is April 1865.